And we again welcome our distinguished witness. And if you would please rise, we'll begin by swearing you in. Do you swear that the testimony that you are about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you very much, and please be seated. Let the record reflect that the witness has responded in the affirmative. Attorney General Lynch, we welcome your first appearance before the Judiciary Committee and look forward to your testimony. Your entire written statement will be made a part of the record, and we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. Thank you, and please begin at your convenience.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Chairman Goodlatte, Ranking Member Conyers, and distinguished members of this committee. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to appear before you today to share some of the recent accomplishments of the U.S. Department of Justice, to discuss some of my top priorities as Attorney General, and to explore ways that we can continue to work together. I do want to begin, however, by commenting on Friday's reprehensible and heartbreaking attacks in Paris. The Department of Justice, and indeed the entire Obama administration, stand in solidarity with France, just as France has so often stood with us. As President Obama said, this is not just an attack on Paris or the people of France. It is an attack on all of humanity and the universal values that we share. We are committed to doing everything within our power to assist our French law enforcement colleagues in bringing those responsible for this monstrous act of terror to justice. And as we go forward, our thoughts and our prayers, of course, remain with the victims and their loved ones. Now, as this distinguished committee well knows, our nation faces a host of serious, varied, and evolving challenges. Our highest priority must always be the security of our homeland, and we are acting aggressively to defuse threats as they emerge. We are working around the clock to uncover and disrupt plots that take aim at our people, our infrastructure, and our way of life. We continue to investigate and apprehend those who seek to harm us, including upwards of 70 individuals charged since 2013 for conduct related to foreign fighter activity and homegrown violent extremism. And of course, we remain focused on the threat posed by domestic extremists as well. At the same time, we are placing particularly emphasis on countering security threats in cyberspace. We are perpetually on guard against individuals, organized groups, terrorists, and state actors who might attempt to steal our data, endanger our economy, compromise our privacy, and threaten our security. In recognition of the need for strong public-private partnerships, we have created a new cybersecurity unit within our criminal division's Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section, and announced a National Security Division outreach initiative designed to promote information sharing and resilience as part of the division's National Asset Protection Program. I have also been meeting personally with corporate executives and general counsel around the country to spread our message of cyber awareness, to encourage strategic collaboration, and to find new ways to protect American consumers. Now, of course, to bring about the stronger nation that we all seek, we must also empower the communities within our borders. Across this country, brave police officers risk their lives every day to protect our neighborhoods and serve the residents of their jurisdictions, and we are tremendously grateful for their dedication and their valor. But we've seen the devastating results of mistrust between law enforcement officers and the citizens we serve, and we've experienced the consequences when decades of tension erupt into unrest. During the first 100 days of my tenure, I conducted a 6-city community policing tour to engage with communities that have made significant progress in this area. In each city, I convened roundtable discussions that included law enforcement officers, public officials, civic leaders, and young people, where participants shared some of the most effective ways that citizens and law enforcement officers could join forces to foster trust, to build respect, and to spread mutual understanding. Restoring that essential trust between communities and law enforcement is one of my top priorities as Attorney General, and the Department intends to do everything we can to foster those bonds and to create safer and fairer communities across the country. Now, we are also paying special attention to vulnerable victims in our communities, particularly those caught in the clutches of human trafficking. In September, I announced that the Department would be extending $44 million in new grant funding to help support research, bring more traffickers to justice, and care for survivors. And at this moment, I really want to thank our partners in Congress for their efforts. By tripling human trafficking-related funding for our Office of Justice programs in fiscal year 2015, Congress was instrumental in allowing us to increase our grant funding in this critical area. This October marked the 15th anniversary of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is certainly a fitting occasion to redouble our commitment to eradicating this pernicious practice. And finally, I'd like to address our efforts on criminal justice reform at the federal level. I commend the committee members who have come together to help chart a new course on criminal justice that will make our society both stronger and more secure. It is a course built in part on the success of the Smart on Crime initiative that my predecessor, Attorney General Eric Holder, launched in 2013, which shifted our approach away from harsh mandatory sentences for low-level drug offenses and enabled us to focus on more significant violent defendants, while better supporting rehabilitation and reentry programs that can reduce recidivism and promote public safety. But more must be done. Prison spending has increasingly displaced other critical public safety investments. And to make our sentencing laws more efficient, more effective, and more just, congressional action is needed. Reform has been embraced by prosecutors, law enforcement, and policymakers of all stripes, and the Justice Department is eager to see meaningful sentencing reform enacted during this Congress. And we thank you for the chance to work with you on that. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, thank you so much for the chance to speak with you today, and thank you all for your ongoing support of the Justice Department's efforts. I look forward to working closely with you to advance the objectives that we all share. And I'm pleased to answer questions from this body at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, General Lynch. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions for the witnesses, and I'll begin by recognizing myself. Do you agree with what your own FBI Director, James Comey, told this committee regarding the inability to adequately vet and confirm the true identity because of the lack of information, databases, law enforcement resources, intelligence resources, and military resources available to us in Syria of Syrians who have applied for refugee resettlement in the United States?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With respect to that important issue, as I've indicated, the most important priority of the Department of Justice is the protection of the American people, and certainly national security and terrorism are one of my own top priorities and certainly an area of concern for all of us. That is certainly our main concern. At the same time, we do have a system for allowing not just immigration, but refugee entrance into the country. As the FBI Director has noted, there is a process in place that allows for significant vetting of refugees from all countries.
Well, let me interrupt because he said something contrary with regard to the situation with Syrians. He said, we can query our database till the cows come home, but there'll be nothing to show up because we have no record on that person.
Certainly with respect to the databases that the Director was referring to, as he noted, I believe, before this committee, there is a screening process that has data from several different agencies. The FBI participates, Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, National Counterterrorism Center, and much information is vetted and queried. Certainly a lot of the information that is vetted does have to be inputted into the system.
In the case of Syria, you can't go to the government offices in that country. They're in disarray. You can't go interview people who know people who are applying for this status. Do you disagree with the FBI Director when he says that vetting Syrian refugees is extremely difficult, if not impossible?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure he said it was impossible. Certainly, not only the Department of Justice, but all of our agencies will make every effort to vet every refugee coming into this country, from the databases to the interviews that those individuals are subject to the biometric screening as well.
Let me go on.
Certainly, there are challenges to that process because of the situation in Syria. But I would note, however, that we do have the benefit of having that significant and robust screening process in place, a process that Europe has not been able to set up, which renders them much more vulnerable.
How do you explain such a precipitous drop in weapon prosecutions and convictions under this administration? And why is such little emphasis placed on these types of prosecutions when the President has called for yet more laws when the current laws are not being enforced?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. With regard to the Department of Justice enforcement of the gun laws, we take those gun laws very seriously and are committed to using the full panoply of laws and regulations on the books. We typically use those laws at the federal level in conjunction with our many and numerous violent crime initiatives. For example, in my former position as U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of New York, many of our gang cases also carried with them firearms charges. They would not necessarily be the lead charge. They may not be reflected in the data that you have, but they certainly are an important tool in every prosecutor's arsenal in combating violent crime.
So somebody going into a gun store to buy a weapon knows that even if they're caught, and often they're not caught because the system doesn't have all the information it needs in it, but even if they're caught, they often find that the odds are 1 in 1,000 that they'll be prosecuted even when they're caught. What are you doing about that? What should be done about it? And why has this decline been so precipitous over the last several years?
Well, Congressman, with respect to the types of cases that are prosecuted, as I indicated, a lot of the firearms prosecutions are done in conjunction with our violent crime program, and they may not show up in your statistics as the lead charges. They are a significant part of the arsenal that every federal prosecutor utilizes. Most recently, I've convened a summit with the top elected officials, police chiefs, and leaders of major cities to talk about violent crime that's currently taking place in several major cities, with a focus on finding the causes and finding the best ways to direct federal resources to those particular cities.
Can we expect these prosecutions to go up as a result of that?
Congressman, what we do is we look at the root causes of violence in a particular area. If, for example, the firearms were the main issue there, we would focus our efforts there. We follow the facts
Not necessarily
and the
prosecute for
evidence.
the gun violation. So if that's the case, would you agree with me then that it doesn't make sense to add new gun laws when we already have hundreds of them that are not being enforced today, and you don't seem to anticipate an increase in the use of those current laws to prosecute people who misuse firearms?
I think at this point it will be difficult to speculate as to what numbers would look like in a year with respect to any particular criminal program. What I would say is the Department of Justice is committed to using the full panoply of laws that are currently on the books as part of our violent crime initiative, as part of our desire to keep all communities safe, and that does include our firearms laws.
2 weeks ago, the President stated with respect to Secretary Clinton's emails, quote, "This is not a situation in which America's national security was endangered," end quote. Should we expect that when the FBI finishes its investigation of this matter, that no charges will be filed? Does the Department allow statements by the President to dictate its investigative practices?
Mr. Chairman, the Department reviews facts and evidence submitted before it. We apply the law to those facts and evidence. We take all the appropriate steps in every matter that we review. And that is how we will essentially manage every matter under our purview, whether it relates to the IRS, to an email matter, or every matter that comes before us. And with respect to the President's comments, they have no influence or bearing on how the Department manages these matters, and I would have to refer you to him for a review of those.
I'm glad to hear you say that. In your view, wasn't it inappropriate for the President to once again inject his personal views into an ongoing FBI investigation?
Mr. Chairman, I really don't have a comment on the President's expression of his views.
Wouldn't it be better if the President of the United States did not comment on the merits of those investigations while they're going on?
Mr. Chairman, I really don't have a comment on the President's statements.
Thank you very much. The Chair recognizes the ranking member, the gentleman from Michigan, for his question.
Thank you very much, Chairman Goodlatte. How are you planning on reaching out to the broader law enforcement community to promote these ideas?
Thank you, Mr. Conyers, Congressman Conyers. This is, in fact, one of my top priorities as Attorney General, and I'm incredibly proud to say that the Department of Justice has already begun the type of outreach that I was discussing at that particular event. Through our COPS office in particular, the Community-Oriented Policing Service Office, we reach out directly to police departments across the country and offer technical assistance, we offer training, we offer peer-to-peer support. We have found that an incredibly effective way to share information within the law enforcement community is peer-to-peer, police officer to police officer, chief to chief. And so we work with the departments that have, in fact, made great strides in the area of police-community relations and seek to match them up with other departments who are having challenges in this area and who would be receptive to their input. I also, as I noted in my opening statement, have been on a 6-city community policing tour. And as I talk with residents, with young people, elected leaders, I also talk with police officers. I do meet with the chiefs and supervisors, but I also talk to the rank and file, the officers who are on the beats of our cities, to get their ideas as to what has worked in their city, as to why a positive relationship has developed in the cities where they have had challenges and where they have had struggles. I've listened to their stories of commitment and dedication and to their embrace of community policing and concern for residents as a program and policy that makes policing more efficient and that makes communities safer. And I'm incredibly proud to support those efforts.
Thank you. But in your opinion, does our conversation about civil rights and the appropriate use of force by police somehow make us less safe?
Mr. Congressman, our discussion about civil rights and the appropriate use of force and all police tactics can only serve to make all of us, community members and police officers, safer. In my discussions with police officers around the country, I have found a positive engagement on these issues. I have found them to have some of the best thoughts and best practices to share with other departments on these issues. Issues like the best practices for de-escalation of certain situations. Issues like the best practices for maintaining a relationship with community organizations and citizens' councils. Issues on police safety. They've provided us valuable input in our programs, such as providing bulletproof vests, body-worn cameras. They are focusing on the best ways to use these new technologies. So while certainly there may be anecdotal evidence there, as all have noted, there's no data to support it. And what I have seen in my travels across this country is the dedication, the commitment, and the resolve of our brave men and women in law enforcement to improving policing, to embracing the 21st Century Task Force recommendations, and to continuing to have a dialogue that makes our country safer for all.
What tools does the department have to combat discrimination in all of the ways it manifests itself? And how are you going to be using these tools in this case?
Thank you, Congressman. With respect to the department's enforcement of our various civil rights statutes, it is certainly robust and will continue to be so. While we no longer have the advantage of the pre-clearance provisions that were in the Voting Rights Act, we still have significant provisions of the Voting Rights Act that allow us to review actions and decisions taken, albeit after the fact, to determine whether there has been either a discriminatory intent or, as is very often the case, a discriminatory result. We can engage in negotiation and conversations. Many times we do that before we even move to litigation in an attempt to reason with or to have a discussion with entities that are making significant changes. And often those discussions are very productive. I was pleased to see that after discussions with members of Congress, that the state of Alabama may be making some modifications to those changes, and certainly those types of discussions are an efficient way to bring about change and raise these important issues. But I will reiterate, Congressman, that the Department of Justice is committed to enforcing the civil rights laws that we do have on the books, and we are committed to a vigorous review of matters that are brought to our attention, and will ensure full and fair and efficient review of those matters and take the action that is appropriate.
What can this committee, the Committee on the Judiciary, right now do that would save at least some of those lives?
Well, Mr. Congressman, I think there is a significant debate and discussion going on as to how to best save lives in that situation. And I think that all voices are necessary in that debate and discussion. And certainly, if Congress were to consider new laws, I'm sure this committee would be deeply involved in discussions. And that is, of course, up to Congress and as part of your purview. And the Department would be happy to work with you with regard to that. I think that we also have to look at the root causes of the violence. As I indicated in response to an earlier question, just last month I convened a summit on violence of several of the leaders of our major cities, police chiefs and mayors, as well as police executives. And what the department is doing is looking for ways to identify the root causes of so much of the violence that we are seeing. Even as violence is at historic lows nationwide, we still have some communities that struggle with this issue. In some instances, it is gun violence. In some instances, we see an increase in drug use, methamphetamine, heroin, opioids, and so we are trying to find our best ways to focus our resources there. Just yesterday, I met with representatives from the National Conference of Mayors and had discussions on these very issues about the differences that all communities present and the need to have a full and robust discussion about these issues.
Thank you so much for your testimony and your views.
Thank you, sir.
Since you are America's top lawyer, do you believe that President Obama can legally ignore legislation prohibiting the transfer of detainees to American soil?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. What I would say on this issue certainly is, as the administration has stated, the closure of Guantanamo Bay is something that is part of the administration's policy, and the Department of Justice supports that as well. At this point in time, I believe the current state of the law is that individuals are not transferred from Guantanamo to U.S. shores. That position is reiterated by the legislation that you mentioned, and my understanding, as you indicated, is that I do believe the President has indicated that he would sign that. And certainly it's the position of the Department of Justice that we would follow the law of the land in regard to that issue.
Well, the question I had is, do you believe that the law is unconstitutional, as Mr. Craig has opined in last week's Washington Post? And would you ignore the law based upon that argument?
Well, Mr. Congressman, I'm actually not familiar enough with Mr. Craig's analysis to comment on that. So I'm not able to comment on his views about the statute. Certainly, with respect to the existing state of the law, the Department of Justice is committed to fully following that. And the closure of Guantanamo Bay is being carried out in compliance with that law. And so I believe that it is the view of the Department that we would certainly observe the laws as passed by Congress and signed by the President. Only very rarely would we take the step of finding that an unconstitutional provision was something that we could not manage. We would, of course, seek to work with Congress and the administration to resolve that issue.
Now, does this mean that you think it's okay for the President to transfer these people, who are some of the world's most dangerous terrorists, to countries other than the United States, but it would not be okay for him to transfer them to the United States?
Well, Mr. Congressman, the current state of the law allows for the transfer of certain detainees from Guantanamo Bay, those that after a vigorous review process are placed in that transfer category to countries that after significant vetting and promises of management can accept them. With respect to individuals being transferred to the United States, the law currently does not allow for that, and that is not, as I am aware of, going to be contemplated given the legal prescriptions.
Okay. In your opinion, what will be the effect on the sharing of law enforcement data with certain of our European allies?
Thank you, Congressman. We fully support the Judicial Redress Act, and I actually would like to thank you and the other members of this committee for the important work that you've done on this issue. As you have noted, this legislation is critical to continued law enforcement sharing of information from the U.S. and the European Union. In fact, I have been involved in discussions with ministers from the European Union on the Data Protection Act, often called the Umbrella Act, as well as the Judicial Redress Act. It certainly is our view that this important legislation should be passed. It would provide, as you know, redress for European Union citizens should there be an unauthorized or misuse of their data here in the U.S., which is a privilege enjoyed by U.S. citizens within the European Union. Without this, we do have a grave risk of not having the completion of the data protection or umbrella agreement. And I think, sadly, recent events have shown us the importance, the critical nature of making sure that we have these safe and secure portals for transferring information from one law enforcement entity to another.
Thank you for your support.
Thank you, Mr. Congressman.
Attorney General Lynch, do you agree that this is not the proper way to honor the heroes of 9/11? Don't you think that 9/11 survivors and the firefighters and police officers who risked their own lives to save them and have suffered health consequences because of it deserve the full support of the American people and a fully funded victims' compensation fund?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. This is indeed an important issue. Of course, we will always be deeply indebted to those first responders and brave men and women who risked their lives to search for and recover victims, to remove debris at the site, to carry out the recovery efforts at Ground Zero at 9/11. Certainly is an important issue both to me, both as Attorney General and as someone who was in New York on 9/11 and who had friends and former colleagues who were in that group of those who were on the scene and who were involved in those activities. This is in fact a serious issue for those who are affected by it, and I greatly appreciate your expression of compassion for those who have fallen ill. With respect to the bill that is currently pending, certainly on behalf of the Department of Justice, we would do all that we could to work with you to make sure that if there were any questions or issues, they could be addressed, and we hope that there would be none. This is indeed an important issue, and again, I think it is something that it deserves certainly strong review, serious consideration, and please let us know how the Department can be of assistance to any of the members as they consider this important issue.
And has anyone ever escaped from a Supermax federal facility?
Well, certainly as a tribute to the strong efforts of the Bureau of Prisons, I do not believe anyone has escaped from Supermax.
Ever?
As far as I know, they have never escaped from Supermax, and certainly the men and women at the Bureau of Prisons are dedicated professionals and do everything in their power to run that institution in a way that protects the American people but also contains the security issues therein. With respect to your question, Congressman, it certainly is difficult to say. Obviously, I have the greatest pride and respect for the brave men and women of the Bureau of Prisons. Indeed, I feel that the men and women of the entire Department of Justice can do anything. So certainly, I think that they are up to any task that is assigned to them. And of course, we look forward to working with Congress to consider these issues should such a change be made.
And so, in other words, the summary of your testimony is that bringing people to Supermax prisons would pose no danger to anyone in communities or in the United States?
Well, Mr. Congressman, I certainly am not in a position to say that any prisoner poses no danger ever. We certainly have these security regulations over a host of dangerous inmates for very, very significant reasons. But I am, of course, tremendously proud of the work of the men and women of the Bureau of Prisons. And, of course, this issue is one that is before Congress. I believe it is going up, as has been indicated, to the White House, and we would work with Congress with respect to whatever decisions are made in providing information that could best inform its decisions.
What are you doing to discourage jurisdictions from claiming sanctuary status?
I'm sorry, the last part of your question, Congressman?
The number of sanctuary jurisdictions has doubled under this administration. What are you doing to discourage municipalities from asserting sanctuary status?
Well, Congressman, with respect to the issues that you raised, certainly they are very serious. We are committed to enforcing our criminal and immigration laws.
But there's a law in the books that prohibits sanctuary cities. What are you doing to enforce that law?
I believe the designation of a sanctuary city is something that was within the purview of...
No, it's actually in an act I introduced that became law in 1996.
I'm sorry, sir, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Okay. What are you doing to enforce that law?
Well, where we have a situation where that situation occurs, we certainly would talk with that jurisdiction. We would reach directly in and enforce the criminal laws against the individuals themselves.
But you're not doing so. Give me one example where you have enforced current law that prohibits jurisdictions from claiming sanctuary status.
Well, what I'd like to do, sir, is study that issue and provide information to you on that point.
Have you taken any disciplinary action whatsoever against the Secret Service managers involved with the disclosure of that file?
Congressman, my understanding is that that matter is being handled by their Inspector General, the Secret Service, as part of the Department of Homeland Security.
Right.
And so with respect to those specific administrative or disciplinary actions, my understanding is that their Inspector General is reviewing that. I'm not able to comment at this time. I would certainly provide information to you.
Okay, and you would certainly let the member involved know of any investigation, would you not?
I'm sorry, sir.
You would certainly let the member involved know of any investigation, would you not?
Well, typically we do not comment on whether an investigation is open or not.
I know. I'm
With
not
respect
asking
to
you to
whether
comment publicly on the details. I'm asking you if you would alert the member if there was an investigation ongoing.
Are you referring to the member of the Secret Service?
No, the member of Congress whose
The
files
member of
were
Congress. Thank you,
made
sir.
public. And
We would certainly do everything we could to provide what information we could consistent with our law enforcement obligations.
okay, thank you. To your knowledge, has the President or any White House staff or you or any of your staff attempted to influence the FBI's investigation of former Secretary Clinton?
No, sir.
Okay. Do you have any idea when that investigation will be completed?
Well, I'm not able to comment on the status of that matter, and we typically do not comment. And also, it's impossible to predict when any matter will be concluded, so I'm not able to give you information on that.
And I'm not asking for a comment on the contents of the investigation, just an idea when it might be finished, or have you heard when it might be finished?
Sir, again, I'm not able to comment on the timing of the conclusion of any matter.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
And I'm wondering, you know, if the department's position has changed since Mr. Holder left the department, and whether you think it could meet due process to have an 8-year-old who speaks only Spanish appear in immigration court without a lawyer and be able to argue the nuances of immigration law and asylum law. Do you think that meets due process requirements?
Thank you, Congressman. With respect to the argument that was made on the issue, of course, I'd have to review those pleadings to understand the specific context and whether or not there was an appropriations issue involved as to whether...
Fair enough. What do you think about the due process issue?
And again, thank you for that issue because it is an important one. And as you noted, certainly it's the department's position that as a general matter, all who appear before tribunals, whether they be courts, administrative bodies, tend to have a more efficient process and a fairer process if they are represented by counsel. Certainly we have statutes and laws to that effect with regard to adults, criminal matters, and the like. For those children, also, it certainly would seem to increase efficiency of the entire process to have counsel. And as you've noted, I believe that through our grant process, we have supported nonprofit or NGO organizations that have provided counsel there for those children.
So you're not willing to say that it doesn't meet due process requirements at this point?
Well, what I would like to do is look at the procedures that are in place before I made a constitutional determination about due process, but I certainly do agree that it's an area of concern and that as a general matter, we support counsel in proceedings for litigants, particularly children.
And I'm wondering, have you reviewed that IG's report yet?
I have not reviewed that specific IG's report, but what I can tell you is that the prosecution and apprehension of individuals at the border is one to which the not just the department but the specific U.S. attorneys in those border states devote significant time and attention. And steps are taken at the initial level to try and ensure that those who are seeking asylum are handled appropriately and that those who are coming in for other intents and purposes are handled through the immigration law system and often the criminal law system.
can I ask you whether you would please take a look at that report and make sure that we're actually using our resources in a sensible way relative to asylum seekers?
Certainly. We're always happy to review the way in which we use our resources.
Here's my question. Do you think immigrants in detention are entitled to constitutional rights of due process and the First Amendment and the like?
Well, I certainly think that when it comes to the conditions in our detention centers, we need to do all that we can to ensure that treatment is fair, humane, and cognizant of the individual rights of all of those who come through those systems. I think that we have recognized certain rights for those within our borders, certain rights for citizens, and in varying degrees with respect to the Constitution. But barring that, or even taking that into consideration, certainly I believe that all of our detention centers should be run efficiently, fairly, and humanely.
Do you feel confident in our processes as a partner to this process of being able to discern who amongst those suffering people would be a bad guy? I understand we're doing 10,000. I think that's the number the President has offered. Do you perceive your processes to be assured and sure?
Thank you, Congressman. And I do look forward to continuing this dialogue with you on this important point. We do have robust screening measures in place. They include not just databases, but also individual interviews, biometric data. We gather all relevant information about refugees from all countries because our first goal is the protection and safety of the American people, as well as carrying out the compassionate nature also of the American people.
And you feel comfortable if a terminology was used that you would certify that you could be confident on those that you processed, that you would use every measure to certify their non-intent to do harm in this country?
Certainly we would use every measure, as we always do, to ensure that those who are allowed into the country would not pose a threat to the American citizens.
What do you think the importance of having departments subject themselves to accreditation, determining best practices, and helping them as well as the American public?
Congresswoman, in my discussions with law enforcement across the country, I have found them eager for assistance in sharing best practices. I've also found them eager for recognition of their professionalism, and accreditation is one way to do that. I think there are a number of ways to do that. Certainly, we in the department are working with a number of the police organizations to try and develop consistent and national standards on data collection, and we rely heavily on their expertise for guiding those standards. And we would look to start with that same process with regard to any move toward accreditation also. I've found that law enforcement, frankly, is focused on professionalism and focused on spreading those best practices as best they can.
I would like to meet as soon as possible with your staff on these issues.
I look forward to continuing to work with you on those important issues. Certainly with respect to voting rights, the pre-clearance remedy was one that we found to be not just effective but efficient. And we felt that it was a way in which to engage with jurisdictions as they contemplated changes to their laws and prevent them from going down a road that would have disenfranchised their citizens. Certainly, we felt that it was efficient and much less costly than litigation. It is an important part of the Voting Rights Act, and we certainly support the efforts to restore the pre-clearance remedy to the Voting Rights Act. Certainly, with respect to...
The time of the gentleman has expired, but the witness can answer the question.
I thank the chairman for his indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With respect to sentencing reform, we feel that it's a vital measure that recognizes that while we put measures in place several years ago designed to protect the American people, as we look back on those measures, we see the collateral consequences that it did, not just to citizens, but to communities. And we also are able to evaluate with the passage of time whether or not those lengthy sentences were the most effective way to deal with the offenders that they tended to sweep up. So certainly as a part of an overall review of our criminal justice system to make sure it is always as efficient and fair as possible, sentencing reform has an important role to play in that, and the Department is supportive of not just this committee's efforts, but Congress' efforts in that regard.
Now that the case has gone through the grand jury process and not gotten the result that the DA wanted, I would like to ask, as I've asked in writing before, for the Department of Justice to look into this case and see if civil rights violations may have occurred?
I would like to have my staff reach out to you and get that information, sir.
Are you familiar with the case?
I'm not currently familiar with the case, although we have a number of similar matters under review.
Do you agree that we should spend more time, our law enforcement, working against meth, heroin, and opiates, and not marijuana?
Congressman, I think that with respect to our narcotics laws, what we try and do throughout the entire Department of Justice and at the DEA is focus on the specific problem in a specific region and devote resources to that. We currently have a crisis regarding heroin use and opioid abuse in the country, and some communities have been consumed by that particular problem. There are, unfortunately, some communities that still have problems with methamphetamine, so there might be a different focus on the type of drug,
but marijuana is not
depending
a
upon
place
the issue.
marijuana is not where cities have people needing marijuana and knocking off 7-Elevens to get some money to buy their marijuana. They're doing that for meth and heroin. Is that not right?
Certainly, we've seen violence associated with meth, with heroin, with prescription drugs as well. The type of violence associated with the marijuana trade typically occurs at the dealer level, at the import level, and I certainly have seen cases where there's been significant violence at that level.
Do you agree marijuana should not be Schedule 1 in the same category as LSD and heroin?
Well, with respect to the issue of scheduling, that is typically determined based on whether or not there is another use for the product. And I think that there would have to be studies by the FDA, among others, to determine whether or not a scheduling change in any drug is necessary.
But don't you agree that you have to change the scheduling from 1 to get the studies? I mean, there are lots of young people, like one of my constituents, Chloe Grauer, who died waiting for the opportunity to get Charlotte's Web. Lots of people who'd like to get cannabinoids. You could talk to Montel Williams and what it does for multiple sclerosis, or any number of cancer patients who it helps with nausea or allows them to eat and have an appetite. Don't you agree, unlike Chuck Rosenberg, that medical marijuana is something serious and should be looked at as an aid to people in our society to get through difficult problems and not considered a joke?
Well, certainly the issue of medical marijuana is significantly different from the criminal enforcement or use of marijuana, and certainly the Department supports the FDA studies in the use of cannabinoids, or the substance within marijuana, that have been shown to have some efficacy.
We're about to run out of time. I hate to cut you off. I would hope you would look into initiating, which you can, taking it off of Schedule 1. It's crazy to have it with LSD and heroin, and should not be there, and it should be studied. Will you commit today to instruct the Office of Legal Counsel to review and reconsider the 2007 OLC legal opinion that's being used today to justify taxpayer-funded discrimination counter to the President's executive order?
I would like to look into that issue. If I could have my staff reach out to you and get more information on that, I would appreciate that.
Can I have a commitment from you to give more resources to people to study prison records and to facilitate the expeditious sending expeditiously recommendations to the President for commutations of the thousands of people whose sentences should be commuted, who are serving time for long-term drug offenses, nonviolent drug offenses that aren't serving the American people by having them be in federal prison?
Congressman, over the last 18 months, the Department has, in fact, taken a significant look at the staffing and resource needs of the Office of the Pardon Attorney and sought to provide additional resources so that every application that comes through, whether it be for a pardon or clemency, can be considered quickly and efficiently.
But it hasn't done that. And let me remind you what Dr. King said. Justice delayed is justice denied. Every single one of those people serving a day in prison who will eventually get a recommendation is having their justice delayed and denied.
And on that note, the gentleman's time has expired.
General Lynch, I want to commend you and the Department of Justice on the fact that 70 individuals have been charged since 2013 for conduct related to foreign fighter activity and homegrown violent extremism. General Lynch, this committee has previously heard how ISIL and other terrorist organizations field potential recruits in publicly accessible social networking sites via encrypted messaging platforms and also over voice-over internet apps. Are these encrypted private messaging platforms and also voice-over internet apps hampering the ability of the department to quickly ascertain and address threats to national security, and if so, in what ways?
Well, Congressman, thank you for the question. Certainly when individuals choose to move from open means of communication to those that are encrypted, it can cause a disruption in our ability to use lawful legal process to intercept those communications, and does give us concern about being able to gather the evidence that we need to continue in our ongoing mission for the protection of the American people.
How so?
Well, with respect to individuals in this country, what we have seen is communications. This is in regard to specific cases. We've seen communications between them and individuals urging them to commit acts of violence, acts of terrorism, and then those individuals dropping from one type of communication to an encrypted method of communication, and we no longer have visibility into those discussions. And so,
well, when you say no longer have visibility into those discussions, can you break that down and explain exactly what you mean?
Certainly. Typically, we would, with a lawful court order, go to a communications provider and focusing specifically on individuals against whom we had probable cause to believe were involved in criminal activity, including terrorist activity, obtain the authorization to review their communications in the past as well as on an ongoing basis. When individuals move to an encrypted platform, one that is not accessible by the provider themselves, then we have a situation where we're not able to have our court orders handled in the typical way. That is to say, we're not able to receive that information and ascertain what these individuals are planning, and also, just as importantly, with whom they're planning these actions. And so we rely on other methods and means, but that is a loss of an important means and an important law enforcement tool.
Is there any way that the department can overcome the use of encrypted data and voice communications by terrorists who are trying to recruit within the borders of the United States, or a terrorist plot taking place between persons inside the United States? Take, for example, the terrorist incident in Paris this past weekend, where I heard one expert say that he would be shocked if the terrorists were not using encrypted communications, perhaps even during the terrorist events. How can the department thwart that kind of activity taking place here on United States soil, given the fact that we have these encrypted communications?
Well, certainly it makes it very challenging. Our approach has been to work with the electronic companies, the internet providers, on a case-by-case basis, and help them find a way, or work with them to find a way to allow them to respond to the valid legal process. And certainly we're having conversations with the industry as a whole to make sure that they can, in fact, comply with legal process and provide us the information that we need. We rely on other means of surveillance, other means of gathering intelligence about those individuals and their associates, but it does cause us the loss of a very valuable source of information.
Okay, with that, I will yield back and thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
What is DOJ doing to reduce the number of guns being unlawfully transported from Florida and other states to Puerto Rico and being used to commit crimes in my turf? Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. And I am happy indeed to have my staff arrange to provide further information for you on all of these points. I can certainly tell you that we are looking to expand our efforts under that MOU. And with respect to specific numbers, I would like to have the opportunity to look into that and provide you with a briefing on that. With respect to the firearms trafficking between the mainland Florida and Puerto Rico, we do have a very strong presence on the island of ATF, along with, as you know, a host of other agencies, and we are looking at ways to deal with that as well. We also certainly will give Puerto Rican cities due consideration in the Violence Reduction Network selections for the upcoming year. I would note, however, that we are also committed, even beyond the Violence Reduction Network, to working with local authorities in Puerto Rico as well as the U.S. Attorney to deal with the situation there. As you note, the homicide rate is down significantly, but it is still far too high, and that places the residents of Puerto Rico in an unreasonable and untenable situation, and we feel it is our obligation and responsibility to do all we can to ameliorate that.
So my question to you is, what went wrong in these cases, and how are you addressing this internally, especially with the FBI, to prevent this from happening in the future?
Thank you, Congressman. I can state to you unequivocally that the Department of Justice does not focus an investigation on any individual on the basis of their race or their national origin. With respect to the specific cases that you mentioned, I'm not able to comment on those specifics at this time.
Everytown Against Gun Violence recently issued a report on such one potential action. Under current law, only people in the business of selling firearms have to conduct background checks. People who aren't in the business of selling firearms don't have to. But some of these people who technically aren't sellers and don't work in the business sell hundreds of guns a year without background checks at gun shows, online or out of car trunks. We have to better define the language. Couldn't we set a number for how many gun sales it takes to be in the business of selling guns? And has your office explored that possibility? And are you considering a threshold like that to define who would be technically engaged in the business?
Well, Congressman, with respect to the serious issue of gun violence, the Department is certainly pursuing all of our enforcement actions that we do have under existing law, and certainly it would always be useful to have additional resources for our ATF to allow them to fully investigate everything that we need and that comes under our purview. With respect to the question that you've raised as to a statutory definition, I believe the statute is going to define that at this time, but certainly the Department of Justice and ATF are committed to rigorous enforcement of that statute.
At what point is it not mismanagement, but it actually is circumstantial evidence of intent?
Well, with respect to the actions that you referred to, Congressman, I think you certainly are accurate when you indicate that our letter noted that the groups that had complained were treated differently from other groups, and they were also treated in a way that did not advance their applications. They were treated badly. So one can understand their concerns and the issues that they raised. With respect to the investigation, as we outline in our letter, under the relevant statutes that we were reviewing, we needed to find evidence of criminal intent. That intent was not there. With respect to the example that you raise, certainly there are certain statutes that take into effect a discriminatory impact. But again, even in our civil rights laws, if one had a discriminatory impact, you would not necessarily be able to prove a discriminatory intent.
He found no evidence of any intent to discriminate, despite the fact that there's a discriminatory effect.
Well, I think the letter does speak for itself in that regard. What I would say is that, Congressman, as a general matter in how we handle our criminal investigations, we do look for evidence of intent, and it comes in a number of ways, some circumstantial, some direct. Every case is different. In every investigation, as in this investigation, we gather all the evidence, we gather all the facts, and we apply the law to those facts and let that determine the answer.
I just cited 3 emails that I think would be evidence of some intent. Don't you think?
Well, Congressman, as I said, I think the letter in its full entirety speaks for itself and does outline not only all of the issues that you raised, but the host of other things that were reviewed and looked at in the course of the investigation, and does explain the conclusions to which the Department came. With respect to the referral, the issue was whether or not there was evidence of a criminal intent. That is to say, did one act on certain views? Was that the reason for the actions? And as we've noted in our letter, and that we've offered to have in further briefings with you, we did not find evidence of that through the million pages of documents and hundreds of witnesses that were interviewed.
I would love to take you up on that offer for a private debriefing, because I need somebody to explain to me the difference between specific intent and general intent.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Attorney General.
Thank you, sir.
So first, you're in Chicago, you're a member of Congress. What's your advice? And second, trace the guns. We're doing it in Chicago. What do you think about across the nation?
Congressman, thank you for the question. You certainly raise an area of concern and priority for the Department of Justice, which is, of course, violence, be it gun violence or any type of violence in our cities as it affects our children, not only those who are the actual victims, but children who are exposed to violence, of course, suffer greatly, as we know, in their later development as well. We feel that the city of Chicago is certainly taking a concerted look at this problem, and I'm extremely proud to note that the federal government, through the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago, is working very closely with local law enforcement on this issue, focusing on the issue of not just firearms, but also the gang violence in Chicago as well. We also have a very strong presence with our federal agencies, FBI as well as ATF, who works closely with the Chicago Police Department on the E-Trace program that you mentioned. We do find it to be a very useful program. We do find it to be something that arms us with the data to trace the source of weapons into neighborhoods who suffer so grievously from them. And certainly it's an example that certainly we would hope could be exported to other cities as well, as you have noted. And I can tell you that we are committed to continuing to work with the City of Chicago and all of our major cities in violence reduction programs. In fact, Chicago was represented at the Violence Reduction Summit that I held just last month with the mayor and the police chief, and we had a very robust discussion about the causes of violence, some of the ways in which the department could be helpful in very targeted ways, whether it is increasing our task force presence, whether it is focusing on dangerous fugitives in the area, whether it is focusing on violence prevention efforts as well. So we remain committed to working not just with Chicago, but all of our cities who are experiencing these troubling issues.
So if you were to suffer something as egregious as a demotion to a member of Congress from your high position as Attorney General, what do you think? What would you do? You're back in Chicago. You got demoted. You're not the Attorney General. You're just one of us, 430.
Well, I certainly would not call that a demotion. I think all of us in public service have a great opportunity
I guess you get my
to serve our people. To serve our people. And certainly I think that within this body there's a lot of significant discussion going on. Obviously the resources to fund the programs that we have on the ground are essential in funding the department's budget that focuses on the Smart on Crime initiative, which does focus on violence reduction as well as reentry and recidivism, because of course a grave concern is as people return home to their communities that they not return to violence as well. So certainly the resources that would be useful for the department's overall budget, and particularly when it comes to firearms, the resources for ATF to continue its vigorous enforcement of the firearms laws and the E-Trace program would be very beneficial.
The federal law enforcement and local police in Baltimore, if you could talk about how those efforts are helping to address a spike in Baltimore, as well as you mentioned your summit, the summit that you had in Detroit, and I wanted to know if you could perhaps share some of the lessons from that summit in terms of how cities are able to address the spike. And then after that, I want to ask you a question about sex trafficking.
Thank you for those questions on topics of great importance to me as Attorney General, to the Department of Justice, and to the American people. With respect to the violent crime issues that we're facing, while we, as we have noted for a number of months and even the last year or so, we're fortunate in that crime in general is down across the country, and in all of our major cities, crime generally is down, but we have neighborhoods where there is a persistent issue of violence. And we have neighborhoods where we either have not seen similar decreases or we have seen increases in violent crime. In my former role as a U.S. Attorney in Brooklyn, I had many of those neighborhoods within my district, so I dealt with those on a daily basis. And I know the importance of a partnership in terms of dealing with that issue. Baltimore is an excellent example of some of the resources the federal government is looking to bring to bear to deal with specific situations. We've partnered with the police department in Baltimore to provide an influx of federal agents focusing on the violent crime problem to aid with the investigation and literally making those cases so that we can remove the violent offenders from the streets of Baltimore and allow the citizens to continue to flourish in that great city. With respect to the summit that I had, because we were looking at this issue from a host of perspectives, actually this summer I asked my United States attorneys in cities that had seen an increase in violence in some neighborhoods to meet directly with their local partners and counterparts, district attorneys, police officers, sheriffs, and discuss the nature of the crime increase and try and focus on the reasons to the extent that they could be gleaned from those discussions for those increases. We were able to essentially accumulate a great body of information there. And as one can imagine, the reasons for crime differ depending upon the neighborhood. With that, we built on that and convened our Violent Crime Summit in October, where we had mayors and police chiefs and U.S. attorneys from those cities here in Washington speaking together, sharing best practices for crime reduction.
So the question is there collaboration between DOJ and DHHS, and can you speak to that?
Yes, certainly. We have a number of collaborations across different agencies. I cannot recall the specific ones with HHS, but I would certainly like to provide you with that information. We also are working with the Department of Labor, and we're working with state and local law enforcement in many ways to not only improve enforcement, but to provide services for the survivors. The services range from housing services to treatment to therapy and the like.
Can you provide to us a status of an update regarding the investigation?
Thank you for the question. I certainly share your concern and regard for our nation's veterans, having several of them in my own family. With respect to that matter, I'm not able to provide you an update at this time. I would like to have my staff reach out to you after we see what information we'd be able to provide to your office.
Okay.
You know, I'm not aware at this point in time of the status of that matter, so again, I would not be able to give you that information. What I can say, Congresswoman, and not to delay the time, is that certainly the service of our veterans is of great importance to us, and we support them in a number of ways, not just through the investigation that you referred to, but through our Service Members Initiative Act and our work protecting their right to vote overseas, as well as our implementation of services such as veterans courts and working with local municipalities to alleviate homelessness in veterans. All of these things, all of these issues plague our veterans and are something that we as a nation need to be engaged in.
Will the DOJ pursue charges against these employees, and if not, why not?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. With respect to a matter that's been recently referred to the Department, it's a matter that is currently under review, and so I'm not able to comment on it at this time.
And I want to thank your team for answering many questions that my office had as we were in the drafting process. I wanted to hear from you your thoughts on this type of legislation and this approach to reform, and about how the enforcement priorities that were outlined in the Cole memo have been working.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. And we're happy to provide information and assistance as needed by your staff as you review this important issue. Certainly, the factors that have been outlined in the Cole memo and that have been stressed in further discussions with the U.S. Attorney community remain consistent. Our concerns are the areas that you mentioned. Where a state chooses to have a legalized marijuana structure, we will review that structure and look at that. But our concern is, frankly, that marijuana getting into the hands of minors and also being trafficked out of state where a state may have not made the same choice. We also have grave concerns about the areas of the edible products that are so appealing to children and expose them to this product, which I don't believe is the goal of the regime that you're talking about, but is a concern of ours. We're also concerned as well about the violence that is still associated with the higher levels of the marijuana trafficking industry. And so at the federal level, we are focusing our resources on that type of enforcement action. And we continue to do so. In my former office, we prosecuted cases involving importation of large amounts of marijuana, utilizing an Indian reservation on the Canadian border, and also utilizing organized crime connections. So we certainly still have a robust practice. Again, we focus limited federal resources on those types of cases. And we're certainly happy to review any proposal that you think would be helpful and to provide comment on that. I'd have to look further at that proposal before I could respond.
Well, it's a bill we've introduced, and we work to get feedback from your office, too, so I'd welcome any feedback there. I also just wanted to ask quickly, you talked about creating a new cybersecurity unit within the criminal division, and I wanted to ask exactly, what made you decide to do that, and what are the goals of that particular new unit?
That is within our computer crime unit. We have a cybersecurity unit focusing on computer intrusions, computer hacking, and the sophisticated types of computer activity that hackers, many of whom are based overseas, are using to infiltrate our computer systems. The types of activity that we're looking at involve not just the wholesale theft of private information, which can be so challenging at a very basic level of identity theft, but also the theft of personal information such as healthcare information, which raises significant privacy concerns, and also intellectual property. We find that private industry is being targeted, particularly our financial services are being targeted at an increasing level by cyber intruders who are seeking to essentially take advantage of American technology and ingenuity and siphon it overseas for production there without the benefit of the work that we put into it. As I indicated in response to Mr. Chairman's question, that recent estimates indicate that approximately up to $250 billion worth of our intellectual property is being lost to us through that. This is a grave concern as all of us seek to make sure that our economy is as strong as possible, that we get the benefit of American ingenuity and American technology, and that we protect what are protected secrets. Many of the matters that are being stolen are not only sensitive, but very, very unique to particular industries and important to the growth of particular discrete industries. We felt that we needed to increase the resources to this because the problem is increasing. In addition, however, it is working very, very well. And one way in which it's working very well is through our connections to private industry. We, along with the FBI and the Secret Service, have made extensive contacts and discussions with private industry, general counsel, CEOs, CIOs, about cybersecurity and the need to share information about breaches when they occur. We are also ramping up within the federal government our own efforts to provide information to companies when we determine that they've been the subject of a breach or a hack. We are working to reduce our response time to get information to them as quickly as possible so they can also begin protecting their data and protecting their information. So it's been a very positive effort.
When you were the U.S. Attorney and you receive inquiries about an ongoing investigation, how would you respond to those inquiries typically?
Well, Mr. Congressman, thank you for the question. It is department policy and certainly my own view as a career prosecutor, but typically our response would be that we're not able to comment on an ongoing matter.
And part of the reason for that is because if you're out making statements in the press, that detracts from the public's confidence that you're doing it by the facts if you're trying to prejudice the investigation. Is that fair to say?
That is certainly one of the reasons, Congressman.
Let me ask you this. When you were an AUSA, a line prosecutor, did you ever prosecute a case against someone with whom you had either a relationship on a personal or professional basis?
Can you be more specific?
Did you ever get assigned a case where the defendant was somebody that you knew either personally or professionally that had a private relationship?
That did not occur in my experience.
Would it have been appropriate, do you think, for you to have had a case if someone who, maybe you work with prior to taking the position as a prosecutor, or would that case likely have been sent to a prosecutor who did not have that relationship?
It depends entirely on the facts and circumstances of the case, what type of case it was, whether it involved an individual, an entity. Every case is looked at on its own merits.
So why not, so that the public has confidence that this is done in an apolitical manner, assign somebody who's trustworthy to serve as a special counsel, and then this way, however the investigation goes out, the public's going to have much more confidence in the outcome.
Well, Congressman, thank you for your letter. I look forward to reviewing it and we'll provide a response.
But why not just forget about the letter? Why aren't these extraordinary circumstances?
Well, Congressman, I would never forget about your letter, first of all, and we will provide a response to that. Certainly, we'll review the issues that you raised, and we'll provide you with a response.
And I appreciate you're going to review the letter, but do you not see why that would cause people a little bit of pause?
Congressman, we will review everything raised in your letter and provide you with a response.
So if our vetting is good, what happened in that case involving the Bosnian who was indicted on material support for terrorism charges in February 2015?
Well, I'd have to look at that specific case before I could provide you with an answer about that, Congressman. And, of course, if it were an ongoing case, I wouldn't be able to comment about it. So, again, I'm not able to give you that answer at this time. And we'll see what information we can provide about that matter. As I indicated, we have a robust screening mechanism for refugees from all countries. It relies upon efforts of not just the FBI, but the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, State Department. It uses interviews. It uses biometric data. It is, as I indicated earlier, a challenging process, as is everything we do in law enforcement. But that does not mean that we're not committed to doing everything that we can to make sure that the process is as robust as possible and that we do everything that we can to protect the American people.
I think the gentleman's time has expired. Seeing no other witnesses, this concludes today's hearings. Thanks to the Attorney General for your patience and your time today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witness and additional materials for the record. With that, this hearing is adjourned.